Since at least 2002, high levels of lead and cadmium in chocolate have been on the radar of health activists and researchers alike. Recent studies suggest that you would have to eat 100 dark chocolate bars a month to exceed global health guidelines. But in some cases, even eating less than 3 dark chocolate bars per month could put you over the health limit. And that's assuming you're not exposed to other heavy metals from anything else. First, let's talk a little bit about heavy metal toxicity and how it can impact our health. Why should we even be worried about lead and cadmium levels to begin with? Heavy metals exist in nature, but also make their way into the environment by manufacturing and other industrial processes. When contaminants of any kind make their way into the environment, they inevitably work their way into plants and animals. When we consume these plants or animals, the contaminants, such as heavy metals, can accumulate in our bodies and cause health problems. Lead exposure, for example, can contribute to organ damage, a lower IQ, and neurological damage that can lead to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease, hearing and vision impairment, schizophrenia, and impaired cognitive function. The accumulation of heavy metals in our bodies over time can also contribute to cancer, kidney disease, infertility, bone damage, and depression. So it might come as a bit of a surprise that cocoa beans, the primary ingredient to make chocolate, are known to have high concentrations of lead and cadmium. But where are these heavy metals coming from? In 2015, the National Confectioners Association said that heavy metals like lead and cadmium are naturally occurring, so there are unavoidable traces of these elements in virtually all foods. However, a study from 10 years earlier by researchers at UC Santa Cruz examined lead concentrations in chocolate from Nigeria and found that even though lead levels in cocoa beans were low, processed cocoa and chocolate products from the region contained high amounts of lead. The study suspects that the cocoa beans were exposed to air pollution from leaded gasoline during the fermentation process. In other words, the cocoa beans fermenting in open air soaked up lead from car exhaust in the area. Additionally, a 2017 NIH study attributed high cadmium levels in soil to uncontrolled industrialization, unsustainable urbanization, and intensive agricultural practices. Essentially, one of the primary causes for heavy metal contamination of soil is industrial runoff or airborne pollutants from industry. But how many chocolate bars would we need to eat to exceed the health guidelines? This is where things get a bit unclear, and you'll have to judge for yourself how often you want to eat chocolate. According to Confectionery News, the World Health Organization has set a monthly intake limit of 25 micrograms per kilogram of body weight for lead and cadmium. The way that this level is determined is one of the key factors for deciding how much, if any, chocolate we can eat per month. In a 2017 lecture by toxicologist Dr. Timur Durrani, he explains that the US regulatory guidelines for lead in drinking water are set by deciding how many excess instances of cancer would be tolerated per 1,000 people. Basically, the recommended safety limit for exposure to heavy metals or other toxins is a measure of how many instances of disease your local health regulatory body is willing to accept per a number of people. This means that the risk is never actually zero, even if you consume less than the monthly intake limit for a particular food, unless you avoid that food altogether. With that being said, Confectionery News explains that a Brazilian study showed that in some cases, a child would have to consume just 3 regular-sized dark chocolate bars a month to exceed the intake limit, which in turn puts children at risk of a series of health defects. In other cases, children would have to eat over 100 bars to exceed the limit. Considering the study had only 30 samples of dark chocolate tested, it's a little unsettling that some of the samples had heavy metal concentrations high enough that just eating 3 bars a month exceeds the WHO safety limits. This is potentially alarming since the average American eats about 3 chocolate bars per week. Of course, this means that some people eat far fewer and others eat far more per week in the United States. With such rampant consumption of chocolate, accumulation of lead and cadmium seems particularly alarming, especially for children. While it's true that the studies looked at dark chocolate and milk chocolate contains less heavy metals, the accumulation in our bodies throughout our lives is enough to cause concern. Adults are less vulnerable than children, but if eating between 3 and 100 dark chocolate bars a month is enough to exceed regulatory guidelines, it might be a good idea to eat sparingly. It's also worth stating that these safety limits don't necessarily factor in your exposure from other foods. If other foods in your diet contain high levels of heavy metals, or if you live in a city where you're exposed to airborne pollutants, it might be much easier for you to pass the safety threshold for these contaminants.